Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Nearly a century of rich western U.S. history is captured in a relatively small tract of land rising above the Laramie and North Platte rivers in eastern Wyoming. That history dates back at least to 1834, when Bill Sublette and a partner set up a small trading post to capture some profits of the fur trade flowing out of the Rocky Mountains. This is Kurt Repanshek, your host at National Parks Traveler. I've come to Fort Laramie National Historic Site to learn more about this history, and I've asked Ranger Clayton Hanson to be my guide. We'll be back after a short break to explore this incredible 19th century setting.
The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the national park system for decades to come. You can see their successes at gtnpf.org. Interior Federal Credit Union is the newest sponsor of the National Parks Traveler. It is the official credit union for the Department of the Interior, which includes the National Park Service. This month, the credit union is celebrating 86 years in business. It was first started by Department of Interior employees and eventually opened its membership to like-minded groups. Its ultimate goal is to be your natural resource for financial services. Not a Department of Interior employee? Not a problem. Visit interiorfcu.org to find other ways to join. Federally insured by NCUA. Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at wnpf.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org.
The National Park Service didn't acquire Fort Laramie until 1938. And when it did, it came into a rich trove of Western history dating all the way back to 1834. To gain an overview of that history, we're walking the fort's grounds with park guide Clayton Hanson. And Clayton, this site really goes back to the fur trade days. I mean, it's seen it all from the early 1800s to the present day.
Oh, absolutely. And even earlier than 1834 in a lot of ways. We're fairly aware that Jacques Laramie, or Laramie, or there are many different ways to pronounce and write his name. He was probably present here when there were rendezvous here in the 1820s even. But really, you're right. In 1834 is when the American Fur Company establishes, Robert Campbell and William Sublette establish a permanent post here at Fort Laramie. They called it Fort William, named after Sublette. It's not really clear where Fort William was, though we're at one of the probable locations, which is near this, beautiful ford across the Laramie River, which you can probably hear in the background, and also above the floodplain. Very important if you're building a fort.
Absolutely, absolutely. And back then, it was kind of towards the height or even the decline of the beaver fur trade, wasn't
it? True, it was. However, the buffalo or bison hide trade was taking off in that era, and that's one of the big draw for this fort in a lot of ways. There were still beaver furs coming in, absolutely, from the Rocky Mountains and beyond, but because this was in many ways a meeting place, sort of at the edge of the traditional lands of the Lakota, at the edge of the traditional lands of the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, not far from the Shoshone or Crow as well. This is a great place to meet one another and meet with those Europeans who are European Americans who are traveling from the East, bringing metal goods, especially, firearms, kettles, beads. I could go on and on.
I'm sure you could. Now, of course, the bison slaughter, the Great Slaughter, as they called it, and Fort Laramie, I believe, was the largest military installation and trading post. There must have been quite a lot of hides come through here.
Yes, well, at least in the 1830s and 40s. I mean, it certainly changes when it becomes a military post. The Great Slaughter mostly takes place after the Civil War, in the 1870s and the 1880s. But sure, when we have an opportunity in a little bit to go to the post trader store, and I can talk a little about how the hides would have been brought in there and sold. But yeah, a huge number absolutely during that period, those 20 some years when it was a fur trading post, and even the 40 some years after that, or that it was a military post.
Now, of course, Fort Laramie is quite sprawling as we look across the parade ground out to Old Bedlam and to the barracks and whatnot. But Fort William really was a much smaller operation.
Yes, so Fort William and Fort John, which was its successor. So Fort William was the wooden stockade fort. For those of your listeners who are, Gen X and younger, they may have played the Oregon Trail game, and when you arrive at Fort Laramie, that's sort of what's depicting, the wooden stockaded fort. Fort John was a adobe fort, and they would have been about, imagine we're looking at this small sort of two-story building here. We call this the captain's quarters. It would have only been about 4 times the size of this building. Imagine one more of this house, so about 50 feet by 50 feet on each side. So not very big at all. So, but in many ways, these weren't defensive locations. They were, at least in the sense of you think of like military posts, because they were trading posts. These walls were kind of like putting a chain link fence up. Keep the trade goods inside, essentially. Yeah.
Now we're standing in front of this beautiful placard overlooking the Laramie River, and you've got a painting of Fort Laramie, or Sublet's Fort, by Alfred Jacob Miller, and it's got this incredible stockade fort, for lack of a better word. Was that the type of construction that existed those days?
Yeah, absolutely. So Alfred Jacob Miller did paint this, and you can see that even though the people next to it, it was not bad. It was 25, 30 feet tall walls. Even though sometimes they say 15 feet, it's not really clear exactly how much he's exaggerating, exactly how much it was there. So maybe I should say 15 to 30 feet. So 15 to 30 feet in their walls. And it would have been, a wooden stockade fort just like that. But again, you can see those dimensions. Imagine each of these persons is, 5.5 feet or so, and you put them together there, and you end up with about 10 lined up and 50 feet on each corner, to each corner.
And did that encompass Fort John?
Yes. Fort John was built here. We know that for certain. Fort William, one of the leading theories is it was also in this location. One of the problems is when you're a archaeologist, and I'm not an archaeologist, but I talk with them a lot, is material culture in the 1830s and then in the early 1840s is not very different from one another. So it's kind of hard to tell. But this would have been a good location for Fort William as well. So we believe that it was here. So Fort John just essentially replaced it. Yeah, when the Army purchased the fort in 1849 from the American Fur Company, it actually used Fort John as storage, as a hospital, until the late 1850s when they demolished it. Actually, completely demolished it in 1862. I keep forgetting.
What was the military looking for when they acquired the fort in, was it 1849?
49? Well, what the military was looking for was essentially a turnkey solution to the fact that there was already this huge immigration taking place along the Platte River Road. So this was already a finished building. The Army was really pressed for cash at the time. So spending, a few tens of thousands of dollars, again, multiplied by about 30 to get today's value, for example. So $500,000, and you already have a building in place to serve as the anchor for when you build a larger military post that would simply be here on the Oregon and California and Mormon pioneer trails. Was a very important part of why they picked this location. And of course, and the same reason that the fur traders were here. This is again, above the floodplains here, but still well watered with both the Laramie and the Platte rivers. A meeting place, an embassy on the plains in a lot of ways with the Native American peoples. So both to fly the flag and if you need to have a meeting with any of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, the Crow, and many other peoples in the northern plains, this is not a bad place to have it.
Now, you mentioned the immigrants coming through, and it was you had a mix, I guess, of the gold rush and then the Oregon Trail, immigrants going out to Oregon and California, the West Coast. And when you come to visit Fort Laramie, make sure you go over to Guernsey and see the Guernsey ruts that are still quite visible from all the wagon trains coming through. But this location, did it take on the appearance of a small town at times?
Oh, absolutely. Especially by the 1860s, this really was the largest town or permanent town of European Americans in Wyoming in a lot of ways, and at least until the construction of Cheyenne, an instant town along the railroad. There would have been perhaps 1,000 people living here.
Living here, not the immigrants coming through.
Yes, not the immigrants coming through. But and imagine, of course, when the immigrants are coming through, they have to come through in a pretty narrow window to make it over the Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades, and even the Wasatch. So imagine coming here, say in the first week of July in 1861 even, or even 1859. Let's put it before the Civil War. And there would have been, tens of thousands of people stretching in either direction along the trails, making those ruts in Guernsey, and also the ruts just outside the fort here. We have a very beautiful setup on the bluffs, the Bedlam ruts, which always invite people to go up there and take a look at those. Very different than the Guernsey ruts, though. So imagine, about 1,000 people here, but then tens of thousands in either direction, as I said. So really, this would have been a dusty, busy place for at least those few weeks of the year.
That must have been quite the sight to see.
Yes.
Now, of course, the Park Service hasn't been able to restore all the buildings here. You've got quite a few ruins in various states of collapse or standing up, if you will. Where should we go next? We're right here at the captain's quarters. Should we hit that, or?
Well, yes. Let's take a look at the captain's quarters. We can talk a little bit more about the military history of the fort and some of the other stories.
Now, of course, today it's a beautiful day. We've got blue sky, a gentle breeze, not too hot, not too cold. But it must have been quite different in, say, August.
Absolutely. So if you read the medical history, often the post surgeons, they were some of the few scientifically trained men who would be permanently at a post. There were also topographical engineers and Corps of Engineers staff that'd be here every once in a while. But one of their jobs was to record, weather events. And, just in many ways like today, you would have had very, very hot days in July and August. Temperatures in the 90s or even triple digits, even in the 1840s and 50s.
And of course, the view from here is incredible. I mean, eastern Wyoming is almost tabletop flat in places, although if you look to the west of the fort, you can see Laramie Peak on the horizon. But right around here, I mean, yeah, we're on this slight rise above the river, and you can see for quite a distance.
Oh yeah, no, the bluffs on either side of the North Platte River Valley here are really incredible. This is really that transition. That Plaza Pancake Land begins just east of here, and we're just coming up into the mountains. And in fact, the immigrants, to just digress about them a little more, as they would have come to Fort Laramie, they would have talked about how they're approaching the Black Hills. They don't mean the Black Hills in South Dakota, they mean the Laramie Mountains. And I like to say that, imagine this, you're coming from someplace like Indiana, where the highest point in the entire state is about 5,000 feet, and you're at about 5,000 feet right here, and in front of you is a peak that's over 10,000.
Though the U.S. Army bought itself an existing fort, it was in rather shabby condition when the first troops moved in. Some days before Company C, the Mounted Rifles, arrived in late July of 1849, immigrant William Kelly reached the adobe fort and was disappointed by what he found. My glowing fancy vanished before the wretched reality. A miserable, cracked, dilapidated enclosure. Some of it propped with beams of timber, which an enemy had only to kick away, and down would come the whole structure. By the mid-1850s, things were not much better. In his book, Fort Laramie, Military Bastion of the High Plains, Douglas C. McChristian describes Fort Laramie as a bizarre combination of architecture, including a walled fort with bastions, a southern plantation-style house, southwest adobes, simple frame cottages, and stone buildings. But the Army, once it moved in, worked on improving living conditions. By 1870, a two-story framed house had been built to serve as the commanding officers' quarters, but it ended up being turned into a duplex for officers and their families. Today, that's known as the captain's quarters.
Well, welcome to the captain's quarters. We call this the captain's quarters, even though that wasn't all it ever was, but later on it was a duplex where commanding officers for companies would have lived with their families. We were talking about how this was a town in a lot of ways, and for much of its history, the Civil War is really one of the big exceptions. Regular Army officers would have brought their families here, so there would have been essentially, this is a duplex, so this side would have been one captain, the other side would have been another. And so you can see, if you take a peek inside, imagine this is a middle-class home in Victorian America, just transported, 1,000 miles across the Great Plains to eastern Wyoming.
Got the stereo view on the table. Nice little wood stove over on the side.
Oh yeah, and the violin, of course. You can make some music.
Is that a violin or is that a fiddle?
Ooh, that's a fiddle.
I think it's a fiddle.
Well, all right. Well, that's a good question. So what is the difference? I always wonder.
I could tell you the difference later, but...
All right. Well, but I'll say a string instrument that you play a bow on.
There you go.
It looks like there's a mandolin even behind it. So, or is that
a banjo?
Yeah. Again, kind of hard to see.
Yeah. So they tried to make life as pleasant as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was, in some ways, forts like this represented the bringing of this kind of like industrial America to the far west, for good and ill. And for, the ill part, we can talk about some of the history of conflict on the Northern Plains if you're interested with Native American peoples. But for good, you're right, this was this comfortable home here for officers and their wives and their families, and often their servants too. Officers were upper middle class or upper class men based on their payments, so often they did have servants with them, especially someone like a captain who's being paid quite handsomely for the 19th century.
But were they servants or were they slaves?
Now that's a good question. So obviously after the Civil War, they were servants.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any enslaved people who were brought here prior to the Civil War. There we are, one of our bugle calls. But that doesn't mean that wasn't the case. The Army officers very frequently did do so, especially Southern Army officers. In the immediate antebellum period, there were many officers from what we'd call the Upper South, so Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and many of them did bring enslaved people with them. Mm-hmm. So the Dred Scott case, for example, was about a man, Dred Scott, who was taken into Minnesota territory. And he, of course, being that was part of the Old Northwest, and the Northwest Ordinance said no slavery here, he challenged that in court.
Yeah. So I see even some bearskin rugs with the skull and the teeth and... Is that realistic? Historically accurate?
We I don't know how much your listeners want me to go into some of this stuff. But no, our understanding is a lot of this is based on actual manifests that were available for officers. Now, many of those are lost, but many of them were preserved, showing what they transported. Just like today, you have the slip from the mover saying everything that's supposed to be traveling with you. So we were able to kind of do a little reconstruction. And so these are also even based on photographs of officers' quarters, whether here at Fort Laramie or other historic forts in the West.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Lead on.
Oh, certainly. But yeah, so like I was saying, so this is a comfortable middle class home in a lot of ways. So very, very nice dining room, kitchen in the back. And upstairs.
Narrow stairway.
Very narrow. Well, this was not designed as a duplex. So I don't know how much you want me to talk about the historic buildings, but this actually was originally built as the commanding officer's quarters and then was divided. So this would have actually, there's a staircase on the other side of this wall here that's exactly the same. It would have been a more normal width.
Gotcha.
But yeah, and you can of course see here's the bedroom for the officer and his wife, the master bedroom, if you will, and then back here, a spare bedroom or a bedroom for the children.
Wow.
Yeah.
3 beds.
3 beds. Well, it wouldn't have been uncommon, for all of the younger children or children to a certain age to travel with the family. So trying to squeeze them into this space. So a little more cramped than, you know, what you might think. This is not a ranch home in the suburbs. Let's put it that way.
Got a nice rocking horse in there and a toy drum.
Absolutely.
Keep those kids happy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, feel free to take a peek back here. It's, again, kind of typical 1870s kitchen.
That's a heavy-duty stove.
Yeah, imagine you know, transporting that. Even in this time when you would have come most of the way by rail to Cheyenne, but imagine, you know, the 100-some miles from Cheyenne in the back of a wagon.
That's got to be a couple 100 pounds at least.
Yeah, at least, exactly.
And then to think that you've got to keep stoking it.
Oh, yeah, well, the amount of wood was enormous. The Army actually did ration wood, especially in posts like this. So officers, based on their rank, would get slightly more cords per winter. But you're talking about, imagine, you know, when you're driving in or away, there are the huge fields north of Fort Laramie, still part of the actual historic site. Those would have been filled with, you know, horses like they are now. We do have a herd of horses here for the winter. They come down from Rocky Mountain National Park. They're the pack horses. This is their winter forage and pasture. There would have been horses like that, but there also would have been essentially football fields worth of wood stacked in these sort of trapezoidal shapes, and those would have been the wood rations for the fort. That actually would have been a lot of the work of enlisted men here. Not combat, but just simply getting ready for the winter, you know, and for the summer in the winter time, vice versa. That constant work of wood detail up in the Laramie Mountains, bring the wood here, it's milled, it's chopped, it's stacked, it's ready to go for the winter time. Then in the wintertime, you cut ice out of the river, put it in the ice houses to prepare for the summer, and you just repeat again and again and again. You can see why some enlisted men called the Army in this period Uncle Sam's workhouse.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
You asked about being a town, and so this gives you some of the idea, like especially in the later period, you know, after 1876 and 77, after the height of the so-called Great Sioux War, this was in many ways, you know, a little town on the plains for the Army here. Picket fences, boardwalks, you know, these two-story gabled buildings, bird bath, which we even have today, you know, which we fill with water. So
I was wondering, is that historic?
The location is, but my understanding is that obviously there's been, you know, some refinishing of the concrete and so on. Sure. So yeah, Officers Row here. The Army, you know, in the period in the 19th century, what they wanted to do was they wanted to build, you know, basically fast and cheap, and with the best locally available materials. So here in eastern Wyoming, there aren't very many good locally available materials. There are some, you know, ponderosa pines, and there would have been even then up in the Hartville uplift north of Guernsey, but not very many. They would have been pretty short. There would have been more even farther away in the Laramies. So then your other option is stone. Build out of stone. Unfortunately, the limestone here, you know, the gray rocks that you might see at Gray Rocks Reservoir, which the state runs as a recreation area, it's not very strong. It tends to crumble. So the other alternative then is to make buildings out of concrete, which they did. So they took that limestone, put it into kilns, baked it at, you know, a couple thousand degrees and to make actual lime, mixed it with, you know, rocks from the bluffs here or from the rivers, and then poured these concrete buildings. Unfortunately, the problem is this is before Portland cement, so it's not waterproof. Once the roofs came off, they began to deteriorate. So we are doing our best that we can to keep them stabilized and preserved here. So they're part of the story, the remnants of Officers Row here. But unfortunately, you know, it would be very difficult to reconstruct these safely. So
just because the walls are so precarious, perhaps?
That's my understanding. Again, I'm not an archaeologist or even really a historic preservation person, but talking with folks, part of it is precarity of the walls, but what we can do is stabilize it. And, you know, and they've been standing like this for now 120 some years. A lot of it with our effort starting in the 30s and 40s, the Park Service, you know, patching here and there, putting in a little stabilization. So we'll see how long they last, though. Yeah. Hopefully a long time further.
This is Kurt Repanshek. We're out at Fort Laramie National Historic Site in eastern Wyoming, along with Ranger Clayton Hanson, taking a tour of this fort grounds. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Listener and reader support make National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation via nationalparkstraveler.org. Western National Parks Association is a nonprofit education partner of the National Park Service. WNPA supports parks across the West, developing products, services, and programs that enhance the visitor experience, understanding, and appreciation of national parks. Learn more at WNPA.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. The North Cascades Institute has a large portfolio. It's an environmental learning center, training center, conference center, and leadership center, all set in the splendor of the North Cascades National Park Complex. Learn more at ncascades.org. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with a breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com, Potrero group.com.
So Clayton, we're along Officers Row now, and we're coming up to Old Bedlam, which is unique in many ways. I understand it's one of, if not the oldest, standing building in Wyoming?
Yes. Or at least the oldest standing wood frame building in Wyoming. There's a lot of, there's a little bit of debate here and there about older structures that were built of adobe or of stone. And of course, there are Native American structures on the ground, like the Medicine Wheel in the Bighorn Mountains, that are certainly much older than this. But this does date from 1849. Just after this was acquired by the Army, they built, basically this is going to be officers' quarters and also a headquarters for the commanding officer. So right next to the location of Old Fort John, the former fur trading post, which became kind of the nucleus of the Army's presence here. And so this has been maintained. People have lived in it, whether the Army or otherwise, until this became a national park, and then we restored it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Now, when we say officers' quarters, what rank would you have to be to get a room here?
Well, that's a good question. So it depends on the era. Sometimes we would have more senior officers in Old Bedlam. So when we walk through, you'll see that this is part of the building is set up as it would have been in the 1860s when Colonel Collins was here with the Ohio Volunteers. But it got its nickname Old Bedlam because it was actually mostly junior unmarried officers. So you imagine these men, mostly in their early 20s, just fresh out of West Point, and how it might have been a little bit noisy. The nickname probably came from the more senior officers, thinking this is a madhouse, quote unquote, because of these young officers here.
I bet it must have been pretty crazy. I mean, first time out of the country, so to speak, coming west to the frontier.
Exactly, and if remembering probably my early days of my 20s, and maybe yours and some of your listeners, they left a little graffiti. We do have some photos of that, and we've reproduced some of it in some of these buildings, just to give you a sense of what they would have done. Sign their names on the wall. I was here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go inside, see what it looks like.
Certainly.
So is the exterior paint historic? I mean, that beautiful white snowy and then the green trim?
Well, it is based on research that was one of the colors here. So that's the other thing. The Army, again, some of the paint colors would have changed over time. It would have depended when you visited. But we have very nice photographs of this building, and it is this brilliant white. So very clearly the exterior was whitewashed or painted white. So. Okay. And again, imagine using that limestone probably to make that whitewash.
Must have been fun painting it too.
Oh yeah, speaking of Uncle Sam's workhouse.
Yeah.
But yeah, so on this side, this is set up, like I mentioned, during the Civil War. The regular Army was mostly fighting in the east, along with many, many volunteer units. So but volunteer units were sent to man the posts out west. So on this side of Old Bedlam, you can see what it would look like, say, in 1864 or so, when William Collins would have been here. So Colonel Collins, his son Casper Collins, the fort was named for him after he died during a conflict with Native Americans near present-day Casper, and Casper is named for his son, and Fort Collins down in Colorado is named for Colonel Collins. So
didn't know that.
Yeah.
I see he brought his spittoon along with him.
Well, yeah, well, yes. Let's put it that way. No, yeah, tobacco use, very, very common in the 19th century, whether cigars, whether chewing tobacco. Visitors from other countries commented on this throughout the 19th century. Americans were spitting everywhere. So I don't know if your listeners want to hear about that, but even Dickens talks about it in his Notes from America about how he was kind of repelled by it. Like, so yeah, we moved from his office to the dining room, but you can see how busy it would have been. Again, a little bit of a reconstruction here, but not too far from what we've gotten from descriptions from others who visited here. Crumpled paper on the floor and on the tables. Obviously this was a busy post, even in the Civil War. This was a regimental headquarters, like we said, one of the biggest posts on the plains. So about 1,200 men would have been in some ways their home, even if they might have been sent to an outpost elsewhere. So it's like that Fort Casper, for example, I talked about around, or Plattbridge Station, which is what that area was known as earlier.
Now, to house all those people, I mean, obviously you've got the military barracks. Where did the civilians live?
Well, some of them had their own houses. When we get to the post trader store, I'll point out where the location of the post trader's house would have been. Though he would have been in a different class than a lot of those civilian employees, let's just put it that way. Others would have had homes or rooms attached to their buildings, especially the civilian contractors who worked for the Army, the civilian quartermaster staff, civilian commissary, blacksmiths, and so on. They might have had a room attached to their shop or just a small house nearby. And then, of course, in the broader area, many of the mixed heritage people who would have traded here as well and been very closely connected with the post trader, they would have had their homes, whether cabins or teepees or some mix in the sort of surrounding countryside. So it would have kind of been a pretty sprawling complex if you think about Fort Laramie in the big sense, covering this whole little bowl here in the Laramie Valley. So
must have been quite the sight to see after you've been coming west from St. Louis, and all of a sudden you come up over a rise and you see this bustling community.
Absolutely, and it is very memorable. You read these memoirs, you read these diaries of immigrants, and they are very this is one of those they're always talking about in reference to Fort Laramie, especially after they've left Fort Kearney, which is now Kearney, Nebraska. Sure. It's very oh my gosh, we're here, or we're 2 days out, and then we're finally there. It definitely was suddenly, this is they're back in what would have been, in their view, civilization. So. Right. I mentioned the junior officers, and how it got its nickname as being kind of a location where they would have been a little rowdy. For example, this is the site in the late 1860s during Red Cloud's War, or so-called Red Cloud's War, the war over the Bozeman Trail, that they were even having a ball here. Though I always wonder exactly what they meant by that on Christmas Day when Juan Felipe, so-called Portuguese Phillips, arrived with news of the Fetterman fight, the Fetterman massacre. But yeah, you can see this may be junior officers' living quarters shared. It would have been, you can see a little more of the kind of almost dorm room, fraternity house kind of look on this side. And when we actually look in their bedroom, you can definitely see the resemblance to the current day. I mean, we want to know I was here. All those signatures.
Those aren't originals, are they?
No, they are reproductions, but they are based on a photograph that we have of a room like this.
Got this beautiful covered porch facing west. You got that afternoon sun. Boy, it must have been a beautiful place in the wintertime when things were getting cold to get a little warmth captured.
Yeah, pulling the shutters and batten down the hatches. Yeah, especially in those days. I mean, I mentioned the high temperatures are very similar, but some of those cold days seem much chillier based on the descriptions I've read. Many days where they talk about the temperature being -20, -40, And, living around here, I've certainly experienced, below zero days, quite a few of them, but I'm struggling to remember a negative 40 day. And just to sort of point out over here, this is sort of the edge of the old post. That's the old powder house there. So that would have been, well, a little close to Old Bedlam, but about as far as you wanted to put it. But then as the post grew in size, more and more buildings were constructed, and this kind of got swallowed up by the rest of the post and then used as storage. Because you don't want to keep the powder in the middle of all these buildings, or it could be a danger.
Is that stone building the powder house, or
yes.
Are these remnant walls?
The stone building is the powder house.
Okay.
So, but yeah, that dates from the 1850s. But yeah, and you can even see, if we walk across the parade grounds, you can see kind of the foundations of the old fort here. This kind of would have been the edge across here, as opposed to this other, 50 yards or so that we've walked since then, where you then see the 1860s barracks along here.
And then we've got these ruins here, some sort of foundation?
Yeah, this was infantry barracks. There would have been another set of infantry barracks over there. You can see those mounds, also foundations. And then, part of the Army in the 19th century is it's a very rigidly divided, between officers and enlisted men. And of course, and then a divide between the Army and the civilian employees of the War Department of the Army. So you notice how there's almost this kind of police presence on the other side. Those are the guardhouses. So where the guards would have been stationed, and where if an enlisted soldier had committed a crime, he would have been sent for punishment. Usually, confinement, bread and water, hard labor, you name it. So put that kind of threat closer to them. So yeah, additional officers' quarters here, and we're coming up on the Post Trader Store.
Next week, Kurt and Clayton return to explore the rest of Fort Laramie, with stops at the Post Trader Store, the military barracks, the commissary, and the site of treaty talks in 1851 and 1868 with the Northern Plains Indian Nations.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. While Fort Laramie certainly is off the beaten path, it captures a robust period of the nation's history and is well worth a visit. Next week, Ranger Hanson and I continue our tour of the grounds and the history they've experienced. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repanshek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcast. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.